In the medieval world, long before stock exchanges, central banks, or multinational corporations, economic life was governed by institutions that blended commerce, politics, and social order into a single system. Among the most powerful of these institutions were guilds. To the modern observer, guilds are often described simply as associations of craftsmen or merchants, but this description dramatically understates their influence. Medieval guilds were not just trade organizations. They were economic regulators, labor unions, quality control boards, welfare providers, political lobbies, and moral authorities all at once. Their reach extended into prices, wages, production methods, market access, and even the circulation of money itself. To understand how medieval economies functioned, one must understand how guilds controlled the flow of wealth and labor with extraordinary precision. Guilds emerged in Europe between the 11th and 13th centuries, during a period of rapid urbanization and commercial revival. As towns grew and trade expanded, artisans and merchants faced new risks: price volatility, unfair competition, inconsistent quality, and exploitation by powerful landlords or rulers. Guilds formed as a response to these challenges. By banding together, members could stabilize their livelihoods and protect their status. Over time, however, guilds evolved from defensive associations into dominant economic institutions. Once recognized by local authorities, guilds gained legal privileges that allowed them to regulate entire industries within a city. This legal recognition was the foundation of their power, enabling them to control who could produce goods, how much could be produced, at what price goods could be sold, and how workers were paid. Price control was one of the most visible and controversial powers exercised by medieval guilds. Unlike modern markets, where prices are theoretically set by supply and demand, medieval prices were often administratively fixed. Guilds believed that a just price existed for every good, a price that balanced fair compensation for the producer with affordability for the consumer. This concept was deeply rooted in Christian moral philosophy, particularly the teachings of scholars like Thomas Aquinas, who argued that excessive profit was sinful. Guilds took it upon themselves to enforce this moral economy. Prices were set collectively in guild meetings, often taking into account the cost of raw materials, the labor required, seasonal conditions, and local demand. Once agreed upon, these prices were binding. A baker who sold bread above the approved price, or a cloth merchant who undercut fellow guild members, could face fines, confiscation of goods, or expulsion. Guild price controls served multiple purposes. On the surface, they protected consumers from price gouging, especially during times of scarcity. But more importantly, they protected producers from destructive competition. By preventing price wars, guilds ensured that no single member could dominate the market by selling cheaper goods. This stability was essential in an economy where margins were thin and risks were high. Artisans invested years in training and relied on steady income to survive. Price stability reduced uncertainty and allowed craftsmen to plan their production with confidence. However, this system also limited innovation and efficiency. New methods that could reduce costs were often discouraged, as lower costs threatened the agreed-upon price structure and the livelihoods of less efficient members. Wage control was another critical function of medieval guilds, particularly in craft-based industries. Guilds operated on a hierarchical labor system consisting of apprentices, journeymen, and masters. Each level had clearly defined rights, responsibilities, and compensation. Apprentices, usually young boys, were bound by contract to a master for several years. During this time, they received training, food, and lodging, but little or no wages. Journeymen, who had completed their apprenticeship, worked for wages, but did not own their own workshops. Masters, the elite members of the guild, owned tools, employed labor, and participated fully in guild governance. Guilds regulated wages by setting standard pay rates for journeymen and limits on working hours. These wage rules were enforced to prevent masters from exploiting workers and to stop journeymen from demanding excessively high pay. At the same time, wage controls protected masters from competition in the labor market. If wages were allowed to rise freely, Wealthier masters could attract the best workers, pushing smaller workshops out of business. By fixing wages, guilds preserved a balance between labour and capital, ensuring the survival of a broad base of independent producers. This balance was central to the guild ideal, a city populated by many small masters rather than a few dominant entrepreneurs. Yet wage control also reinforced social rigidity. Upward mobility within the guild system was theoretically possible but practically limited. Becoming a master required significant capital, political connections, and approval from existing masters, who had little incentive to admit new competitors. Over time, guilds increasingly restricted entry into mastership, turning what had once been open systems into hereditary elites. Sons of masters enjoyed privileged access, while outsiders faced steep barriers. Wage controls thus became a tool not only of economic stability, but also of social exclusion. Laying beyond prices and wages, guilds exerted influence over money itself, particularly in how it circulated within local economies. While guilds did not mint coins, that power belonged to kings and princes, they played a crucial role in regulating monetary use. Many guilds required transactions to be conducted in specific currencies or within approved marketplaces. This helped stabilize local trade and reduced the risk of fraud in an era when coins varied widely in weight and purity. Guild officials often inspected coins and rejected those deemed debased or foreign. In this way, guilds acted as informal monetary authorities, enforcing trust in daily transactions. Guilds also controlled credit, which was essential in a cash-scarce medieval economy. Many artisans relied on delayed payments, barter, or informal loans to operate their businesses. Guild membership provided access to internal credit networks. Masters could borrow from fellow members, secure loans for tools or raw materials, and rely on guild-backed guarantees. This reduced dependence on external moneylenders, who were often viewed with suspicion or moral condemnation. By managing credit internally, guilds kept wealth circulating within their own communities, reinforcing their economic autonomy. Another powerful mechanism of guild control was regulation of production. Guilds dictated how goods were made, specifying materials, techniques, dimensions, and quality standards. These rules were enforced through inspections and penalties. On one level, this ensured consistent quality, protecting the reputation of the city's products in regional and international markets. A merchant buying cloth from a famous textile town could trust that guild standards guaranteed its quality. On another level, production rules prevented efficiency gains that might disrupt existing economic arrangements. Innovations that increased output or reduced labour were often resisted as they threatened price stability and employment. The control of market access was equally important. Guilds typically held monopolies over specific trades within a city. Only guild members could legally produce or sell certain goods. Non-members faced fines, confiscation, or expulsion from the market. This monopoly power allowed guilds to enforce their economic rules with remarkable effectiveness. It also enabled them to influence urban politics. Guild leaders often served on city councils, advised rulers, and negotiated tax arrangements. In many medieval cities, guilds were the backbone of municipal government, blending economic and political authority into a single structure. Guilds also used moral and religious authority to legitimize their control. Many guilds were associated with patron saints and participated in religious festivals, processions, and charitable works. This religious dimension reinforced the idea that guild regulations were not merely self-serving, but morally justified. Price controls were framed as protection against greed, wage rules as safeguards of fairness, production standards as expressions of honesty and craftsmanship. By embedding economic regulation within a moral framework, guilds reduced resistance and strengthened social cohesion. However, the system was not without conflict. Consumers sometimes resented high prices and limited choices. Journeymen frequently protested wage restrictions and barriers to advancement, occasionally forming their own associations or staging strikes. Rulers, eager for tax revenue and economic growth, sometimes challenged guild monopolies by granting privileges to outsiders or encouraging competition. These tensions intensified as economies grew more complex in the late medieval period. Long-distance trade, expanding markets, and technological change strained the guild system's capacity to control prices, wages, and money. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the limitations of guild control became increasingly apparent. Fixed prices struggled to adapt to fluctuating supply and demand. Wage regulations conflicted with labour shortages and rising living costs. Production rules slowed innovation at a time when new techniques could dramatically increase output. Merchants operating on a larger scale found guild restrictions cumbersome and sought ways around them. Gradually, states began to assert greater control over economic regulation,